我靠！如果我是男生，现在应该在闭麦在笑。
哇，你的笑声有很多种哎。通常他们的笑声就一种，你的笑声分很多种。
各位特种兵，请准备。
跟随情绪的变化而变化。
这确实还蛮有特点的。
这女生太御了，太御了。
那你的笑声也非常的有特点，挺好的，挺好的。迄今为止，我就有一个朋友。
你跳吧。
不，你飞。
我不会飞的，
没关系，没关系，我无所谓了。
是，那我们去夜店吧。
可以。
就这样。
好嘞。
相信我，带你去。
当然。
带你去我家。
去你家？
那里面朝大海。
啊，春暖花开。
没有花。
啊，那去干嘛呢？
吹海风。
不是你的笑声为什么就是时而特别的狂放，时而特别的啊？
我也不知道，从小就这样，还是不要笑比较好。
很厉害。哇，你
有时候就很像鸭子。
没有，你的笑声好像就是不同的人发出来的。
啊，真的吗？
对，还蛮有意思的，
我可能有好几个。
你有好几个人格。
但是我之前提到一个小姐姐，我们俩就是笑声也很像，然后呢也很像，然后别人就说好吵。
那不可能。那如果我匹配
像800只鸭子，巨吵，2个人真的。
啊，
那时候打4排嘛，队友就分了，另外2个队友就分了。
那是他们不懂得这个 happy 的乐趣。
男人懂啥呀？现在没有人吧？你看我家随便走。
那这个地方是蛮多人的家。
现在没有，你来了嘛？我他们都别来，今天就招待你。
谢谢你。
看吧。
太客气了。
要什么自己接。别客气。
挺好的，你家物资挺不错的。
对，我家还有2艘船呢。
能开吗？
来船上看一看。
我只能看。
开不了。
哇，你家真的蛮肥的。来，
我这里有
物资。再给你一把 M4。
我有了。
哎，
来就是 M4，毕竟是你家嘛。
OK 呢。
有个4，哎呦，有个4呗。
是标了吗？还是说你要
小标掉下来了，我要重新爬上去给你点。
OK。这仪式感不能少。好嘞。哇，谢谢。我
不能告诉你在哪，我得给你标了。
太棒了，
对吧？这是什么呢？
啊？
就不能问你要不要啊？快，这有个人机。
没事，你打。
这么客气，不好吧？啊，那我就打了。他想进我家，是不可以的。守卫家园，知道吗？
保护萝卜，我听过。哇，
一看就平时没少上网的。
是，就是喜欢打那小
游戏。家里连了网线了。除了打小游戏，平时还干嘛？
除了打游戏，平常干嘛？平常就研究一下
帅哥，看不看腹肌？
看腹肌就看好了。你这么说的话，你平常看腹肌比较多是吗？
那打开全都是。
那
大数据，那抖音一打开，你知道吧？那9宫格全都是，就那帅哥。2手往后背一插，往下一摸，然后衣服就没了。
等等。不是。
你没刷到过吗？
我还蛮。不是。就是我平常刷的都还这种，我喜欢看衣服的。
对啊，就一开始有衣服啊，
你不是
这样各种各样的衣服，后来衣服就没了，就是拍着拍着就没了，不是那种
哇哦，
就变成8块了，你知道吗？
哇，太棒了，
然后
太棒了。好 6。
So let's keep moving along then and get into the real meat of the lecture, which is how do we measure? And we're going to start with the concept. Okay, what do we even mean when we're thinking about measurement? What are we even trying to worry about? So we're zooming way back here. All right, what is this concept of measurement? Okay, say we are running an early childhood development intervention. Okay, what we would really love is to just have brains, right? That's what we really care about. Is this early childhood intervention actually affecting kids' brains? Now, typically, we're not actually, increasingly we could do MRIs and things like that and try to see into people's brains. But what we tend to think about is intelligence. We want to know, does this early childhood intervention actually affect kids' intelligence? Now, intelligence is a little bit of a tricky thing, right? This is a construct. This is not something that we can go out and measure. Intelligence is kind of abstract thing. And we use it as sort of typically a shared construct, but if we really got into a deep discussion right now, each of you might have a different idea about what intelligence really means, right? So in this sense, it's a construct. Okay? Our goal is going to be the bullseye, right? We really want to try to figure out how to measure this construct of intelligence so that we know if our early childhood intervention actually affected these kids' intelligence. Okay. One way that people often try to measure intelligence is with an IQ test. Okay? Now, IQ tests can be a little controversial. People often think that they're biased for various reasons. It may be that certain groups are more predisposed to do well on them because of other exposure, because of other things like that. They can be affected by literacy, by numeracy. This is an example of a Raven's test, something that's often used for low literacy level populations as an IQ measure. The IQ test is going to be our indicator, right? Our goal is for our indicator to accurately measure our construct. If there's some bias, it might not actually fall on the bullseye, okay? So if this IQ test is only an imperfect measure of our true construct, whatever that means, the construct thing is a little bit vague, right? But if our indicator is an imperfect measure of this construct, we might be a little bit away from the bullseye. Now, we're going to go out and do a bunch of IQ tests on these kids, and that's going to give us some results, right? We're going to see their IQ scores. And those eventually are going to be our data, right? That's what we're going to analyze. That's what we're going to use to see, did this early childhood intervention actually affect intelligence? Now, you can see the problem here, right? We've got this underlying construct, which itself, to begin with, is a little bit vague. We're going to layer on top of that some indicators, which might be biased for all sorts of reasons. And then we're going to try to actually implement it. And maybe some of these kids are being tested first thing in the morning when some of them are still asleep and others are really high performing. Some of them are going to be tested in the afternoon when everybody's either had a good day or a bad day already, and so some of them are going to maybe not do as well. So there's also going to be the stage between the indicator, which might be perfectly good, and the data that we actually get out of it, which is another stage at which things might get screwed up. Right? Now let's think about another example here. All right, we might also want to think about, does this early childhood intervention affect stress levels in kids? Okay, again, stress is going to be our construct, right? Stress is this kind of vague thing. It turns out we tend to think that cortisol levels are directly responsive to underlying stress. All right, so this might be a relatively more accurate measure of the construct that we're after than IQ was of intelligence, right? So cortisol may be very responsive to stress. Stress goes up, cortisol goes up. But it also may be that cortisol levels are also very influenced by other things, by time of the day, by blood chemistry, by other things like that, which is going to mean that even though our indicator in this case is a much better approximation of our underlying construct, the data that we get out of it may still have a bunch of extra noise that's been introduced by testing procedures, by data collection procedures. Okay, let's try to formalize this a little bit more. Right. We've got our constructs. In most cases, this is what we are actually after. This is what we want our programs to affect. Okay? We care about the constructs, but they're almost impossible to measure. So instead, we're going to rely on indicators. Okay? Now, these indicators are going to be, in many cases, things that have been used elsewhere. In some cases, maybe we're going to have to develop them ourselves. But then there's going to be this really important stage of going from the indicator to the data, which is, how does the data collection actually happen? What is the response? Formalize this a little bit more. We've got our constructs. In most cases, this is what we are actually after. This is what we want our programs to affect. Okay?
我觉得你非常不错，就是连夸奖的话都没有。
没有，他当时还说加微信的，结果就开始装掉线，然后过一会儿我就不走，我看他干嘛嘛，过会儿他就上线了，上线之后他看我还在，他就退了，你知道吗？我去，真的服了，怎么还这样啊？5块钱都跑单，我的天啊！
等于说你被他打了多久啊？
一打
啊，一单是5块啊？半
小时，我说的半小时5块，然后本来说他也没有说要 再打，不是加微信嘛，结果还开始装掉线嘛。
所以你就跟他打了一把，然后他还没有付钱给你。
对啊。真的是5块钱。
他好过分哦。
我会觉得好高，这么难。
所以他是你的第一单，你第一单没有赚到钱。
对，
这样吧，妹妹，这样，待会儿你继续当老板，我陪你，赚的钱你拿。
我们就涨价
啊！
我们要涨价，我们不能5块。
没关系，价格你定，反正赚的全归你，我呢就负责就是点你送我。
By testing procedures, by data collection procedures. Okay, let's try to formalize this a little bit more. We've got our constructs. In most cases, this is what we are actually after. This is what we want our programs to affect.
没事，我让你站。
We care about the constructs, but they're almost impossible to measure. So instead, we're going to rely on indicators. Okay. Now, these indicators are going to be, in many cases, things that have been used elsewhere. In some cases, maybe we're going to have to develop them ourselves. But then there's going to be this really important stage of going from the indicator to the data, which is how does the data collection actually happen? What is the response that we're getting that delivers the information on this indicator? Okay. Now things can be difficult at all stages. So our first question for you guys all have your little clickers? Our first question for you guys is going to be empowerment. Many programs claim to affect empowerment, right? The women as policymakers case. One of the possible outcomes was maybe women are going to be more empowered. What do you think empowerment is? Is it a construct, an indicator, a response, some data, or Kelsey, I have no idea what you're talking about.
我想想，好像在这儿。
标记了一处地点。
哇，
但我不知道那个人在哪。
标点非常标的不错，等会儿我绕会儿。但我听枪声怎么不像在那个位置呢？你确定？
枪声就我小熊猫，小熊猫就在那。队友不知道在哪。
屁股后面的有人。因为你这个位置不行，待换位置。
位置。小熊猫怎么办？
你先换个位置。
他把我小熊猫偷走了。
要不先咱们别管小熊猫了，咱们先活着，你说呢？
让他回动物园，让他回动物园。我，别打帅哥！
啊？
打我！打帅哥！
哪有帅哥？
我。
你称自己为帅哥？
我就是帅哥。
啊，你对自己的这个评价还是蛮特别的哈。
帅哥要死了。在哪？我没看到他呀。
金标，石头后面。
标记了一处地点。
让我看看啊。没看到。
没看到。
真没看，因为我开进之后有一棵很大的树。
没关系，我们不用管它，要不我们先走，你说呢？
那我们去找小熊猫吧。
你说有没有可能现在这个时候小熊猫已经跑掉了呢？
哦，有道理。
啊，没事，你的小熊猫没跑，小熊猫还在呢。
在哪儿啊？不是吧？不是吧？
啊，你没啦？
这么突然？
哦，你在呢，没事，你活着就好呢。
我不行。
你可以的，可以的，可以的。你别过去。
我不行。
他们挺残的，他们应该没看到你。
他们看到我了，有个人还冲我开枪了。
哇，很棒，很棒！再说一次，哎，好嘞，特别棒，特别的厉害。
哇，妈！
你刚刚是什么声音？刚是个啥？我宝宝听到动物园什么东西叫了。我妹妹你好厉害，你王牌6个行了。
哎呀，我按到我的那个锁屏键了，直接就锁上了，我真醉了。
啊，没事，没关系。
啊，
没事，问题不大。
我的天！还有一件事情，就是我强制。
啊，那太可惜了。
那我怎么办？
你强制多久啊？我还想带你去赚钱呢。
15分钟。
15分钟，那你15分钟之后来找我好不好？
行。
你要 你要同意我15分钟之后，我带你去赚钱。
OK， 今天必须赚到那5块钱，好吧
？OK， 完全 OK。15分钟之后找我好吗？
好，那我加你吗？
好，一定要记得找我啊。好嘞。
我先下午15分钟再上。
好嘞。
美女，拜拜。
哎，拜拜。这样吧，我估计妹妹蹲是蹲不到的。我们到时候这个样子，就是在大厅，我来招募。哎，我这样拉你们，它会显示吗？就我们选2个，选几个呢？选个幸运的孩子上来一起打，让这个钱我给你们，就负责当老板就好了，好吗？因为估计他蹲应该是蹲不到的，就蹲半手都蹲不到什么老板。哎，你不要老是来整人，给我拿走。
他外面潮的。
你早上们那就吹太阳了。
明天白天我拿走。
你不要天天往我这边放好不好？
那不是你这个音。
没有，这不是他说他那个被跑单了吗？跑单反正本身我也是要给他的呀，刚好给他一点点那个一点点自信嘛，蹲到老板也会开心一下的。就正常打嘛，好歹也是曾经的同行。到时候大家从那个招募里进去，你们就负责玩好了，然后到时候让管理加他好友，然后我发给他，你们就负责当好老板，好吗？就是谁先来谁当。招募不显示，那 OK 啊，到时候就招募。等15分钟之后，那我们就再打一把，等他那个，等他上线。哎，我是应该同意他们，应该是。等我今天同意他一下，不然我待会忘记了。他搁哪？你在这呢。不一定能看到我招募。哎，我们到时候定个暗号好不好？就是进来之后，比如说暗号是什么暗号？我想看。吃了吗？定暗号吧。你不要15星，这妹妹打不过啊！你妹妹，她现在赚钱的，不是来哭的。在南方见过你，那不好吧？没关系，待会儿她来的时候我们再说。我们今天随便再打一把先，等她一手，等她15分钟 ，OK 吧 ？OK。反正本身也打算给她，不如带你们一起玩一下。噔噔噔噔噔，我们再来找一个。我这边完全看不出来耶，我裙子是一个。但是好像没有。哎，这一看就咱们家人好不好？就这个。哎，也不一定哎。帅哥加个微信啊，那不是咱家人。我现在看这个头像，我那个啥了，我以为咱家人呢。谢谢隔壁小王的咖啡的比心，谢谢不，这是什么？谢谢云朵的万象烟花，谢谢云朵，谢谢哈亚的多喝热水，谢谢抓汁的捏捏小脸，谢谢小叮当的万象烟花，谢谢小叮当。那我们去看看。
没必要说我大号，真的很厉害。
那我可以白嫖一顿吗？白嫖一单吗？我可以带你吃鸡。
好吧。
啊，这孩子不是当老板的吗？他带他吃鸡，他 他带他吃鸡，让白嫖，免费啊，6啊，这也可以啊。Hello， 你好，大妈。嗨，你好。好，不好意思，拜拜。换一个。哎，是哈，反向操作。这搞妹啊的神枪手，谢谢。Hello， 你好，大妈。
大
哦，你穿的很帅。
你已进入1级战备状态，加油，特种兵！
是怎么了？
不是我的声音好听。
So I would agree. I think empowerment's a construct.
你的声音蛮好听。
And think about it. How would you measure empowerment? We need an indicator, right? So empowerment itself is this underlying construct that we would like to affect,
快就要起飞了。
but we're going to need to turn that into something else to actually be able to collect some data on it. All right, let's look at another one. Okay, what about blood pressure is 110 over 71? Is that a construct, an indicator, a response, some data, or again, Kelsey, no idea what you're going on
没
about
事
here.，
我之前、现在一直都在。
你要上分吗
All right,
我
almost everybody. Okay, good. Most of you think this is data. Yeah. So this is the actual thing that we get out of the blood pressure test, right?
没事没事，我不上分。
Good. The C is also, I kind of thought maybe it was C as well, right? It's kind of somewhere in between, right? So this is an individual response to this indicator. The response is getting the data out of the blood pressure cuff or whatever it is. It's collecting the blood pressure. This actual number is going to be our data, right? So this is what we are recording. This is after the response, we've got something on paper that we can start to analyze. Okay, good. After the response, we've got something on paper that we can start to analyze. Number is going to be.
这些好饭
Right?
换
So this is what we
坏
are
饭的都喝
recording.
热
This
水
is。after the response, we've got something on paper that we can start to analyze. Okay.
OK，
Okay, good.
先进去。
One more, maybe two more. Discrimination is.
小心。哎你，他怎么能从后面？
Okay, totally agree. I think discrimination is a construct. Very hard to think about how to measure something. It's this kind of, again, thing many programs would like to affect, but we're going to need some indicators to get there. Okay, one more. Kilograms of rice per hectare. What do you think? Construct, indicator, response, data.
背对着他，我的问题，
No idea.
我应该帮你解决一个的。嗨。
Good. Okay, I agree. I think that kilograms of rice per hectare is an indicator. What is it an indicator of? Agricultural productivity, right? Something like that, some kind of underlying construct. Now, we're going to measure that in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We might get averages of less than 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Some parts of the rich world, we might get outcomes upward of 10,000 kilograms per hectare. Okay, those would be our data. Our response would come from going out and figuring out whether it's through a survey, whether it's through some on-field measurement, how do we actually collect that information, what responses are we getting to this indicator for the underlying construct of agricultural productivity. Okay,
飞机很快就要
awesome.
起飞
You
了
guys are doing great.
各位特
Okay,
种
let's
请准备。
think then about these indicators, how they map on to our constructs, and we'll think a little bit as well about the responses and that chain that I showed you before.
we're gonna 无锡迪西的挚爱明珠。谢谢无锡迪西，谢谢漫步的比心兔兔，谢谢漫步，谢谢您宣带的祝贺，谢谢尾巴的捏捏小脸，谢谢南总家某某的熊的神枪手，谢谢。完了，我又失忆了。夜渊，哎，音渊，哎，夜渊，哎，什么渊？哦，夜渊的神枪手，谢谢远的斑斑的鲜花。OK， 我认真了，先把面子找回来。没有人吗？
我好像没看到。
没人。
有人。
OK。
有，听到了。
我跟你一起，我跟你一起。
没事，搜一下。
在那个顶上。
对，下面一个，对，上面一个，下面一个。
就这样。你打的是？你打的是我头顶。哇，厉害！哦。啊，你瞧瞧人家。哇，人狠话不多。
在这儿。
干嘛？我不帅吗？虽然人家是很帅，但我也……哎，
你是这人吗？
我刚刚好像听你那边有。
我是这人。
嗯，
对。
哪呢？能标个点吗
？2个。
前方有危险！
哎，我来了。在前面的房区是吗？
对，楼顶有一个，楼下有2个。我没有，
没有被禁是吗？
哎，我的，
啊？
我怎么倒了？哪打的？哇，你来小心一点。
嗯。
我脸上了，我脸上。溜。我先打药。
Well, about the responses and that chain that I showed you before.
Wow.
We're going to have kind of 2 groups of concepts. I put a few different terms up here. Some of them may be more familiar to you than others, okay? So we can think first about accuracy, right? Again, our goal about the responses and that chain that I showed you before. We're going to have kind of 2 groups of concepts. I put a few different terms up here. Some of them may be more familiar to you than others, okay? So we can think first about accuracy, right? Again, our goal is the construct which is at the bullseye, okay? So we can think about how well our data, each of these dots are a piece of data, right? How well those data fall over our construct, how accurate they are. If they're away from it, we might think they're biased, right? And we're in particular going to use the term validity to think about the mapping of an indicator onto a construct, okay? So this is referred to often as indicator validity or construct validity. Do we actually have a good mapping from the indicator that we're trying to measure to the underlying construct, which in many ways is what we actually care about, okay? In many cases, we don't care about the as indicator validity or construct validity. If they're away from it, we might think they're biased, right? And we're in particular going to use the term validity to think about the mapping of an indicator onto a construct. So we can think about how well our data, each of these dots are a piece of data, right? How well those data fall over our construct, how accurate they are. If they're away, again, our goal is the construct which is at the bullseye, okay? So we can think about how well our data, each of these dots are a piece of data, right? How well those data fall over our construct, how accurate they are. If they're away from it, we might think they're biased, right? And we're in particular going to use the term validity to think about the mapping of an indicator onto a construct, okay? So this is referred to often as indicator validity or construct validity. Do we? And we're in particular going to use the term validity to think about the mapping of an indicator onto a construct, okay? So this is referred to often as indicator validity or construct validity. Do we actually have a good mapping from the indicator that we're trying to measure to the underlying construct, which in many ways is what we actually care about, okay? In many cases, we don't care about the indicator other than the fact that if they're away from it, we might think they're biased, right? And we're in particular going to use the term validity to think about the mapping of an indicator onto a construct, okay? So this is referred to often as indicator validity or construct validity. Do we actually have a good mapping from the indicator that we're trying to measure to the underlying construct, which in many ways is what we actually care about, okay? In many cases, we don't care about the indicator other than the fact that it's measuring some construct, right? So we need these 2 things to really layer one on top of the other, right? What we would like is something that looks a little bit more like that right-hand picture than something, so we don't care about the indicator other than the fact that it's measuring some construct, right? So we need these 2 things to really layer one on top of the other, right? What we would like is something that looks a little bit more like that right-hand picture than something that is off on the side, okay? So our goal from the indicator that we're trying to measure to the underlying construct, which in many ways is what we actually care about. Okay? In many cases, we don't care about the indicator other than the fact that it's measuring some construct. Right? So we need these two things to really layer one on top of the other. Right? What we would like is something that looks a little bit more like that right-hand picture than something that is off on the side. Okay? So our goal is going to be to think about indicators that are valid. Right? Now, this is not a binary problem. An indicator is not valid or invalid. Right? It may be over here, maybe here, maybe here, maybe here. Hopefully, it's going to be right over the bullseye. That's our goal. Okay? All right. Now, we're also going to be worried about how spread out these data points are. Okay, so think about the IQ example. Or actually, think about the cortisol is probably a better example. Think about the cortisol example. It may be that it's actually going to give us some very precise information, but perhaps it's going to be pulled off to the side because of something that time of day, for example, when it's actually being collected. Actually, that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is bad, it could be that we're getting some very precise measures, but they're not over our bullseye at all being collected. So that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is bad, it could be that we're getting some very precise measures being collected. So that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is still we're getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is bad, it could be that we're getting some very precise measures, but they're not over our bullseye at all, so we'll be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. Something that time of day, for example, when it's actually, or actually think about the cortisol is probably a better example. Think about the cortisol example. It may be that it's actually going to give us some very precise information, but perhaps it's going to be pulled off to the side because of something that time of day, for example, when it's actually being collected. Actually, that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is bad, it could be that we're getting some very precise measures, but they're not over our bullseye at all. Right? Spread out these data points are. Okay? So think about the IQ example. Or actually, think about the cortisol is probably a better example. Think about the cortisol example. It may be that it's actually going to give us some very precise information, but perhaps it's going to be pulled off to the side because of something that time of day, for example, when it's actually being collected. Actually, that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be something that time of day, for example, when it's actually being collected. Actually, that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is bad, it could be that we're getting something that time of day, for example, when it's actually being example. It may be that it's actually going to give us some very precise information, but perhaps it's going to be pulled off to the side because of something that time of day, for example, when it's actually being collected. Actually, that probably would just move things around a little bit. We still would be getting a very accurate measure. So the precision is just going to be how concentrated are the points, how well is the data that we're collecting actually matching the indicator. But then if the indicator is bad, it could be that we're getting some very precise measures, but they're not over our bullseye at all. Right? So we're going to think about this as the reliability, both of the response, okay, so we'll talk about response reliability, and also of the indicator. Right? So when individuals are responding to the indicator, are you getting something that maps on to the indicator itself? And then in addition, is the indicator actually mapping on to the bullseye? Okay, so a good example of both of these is we could think about collecting, if we care about something about nutritional outcomes, right? We could think about collecting height and weight. Height and weight are pretty precise, right? Put me up on a doctor's thing, and they're going to say I'm 5'3". And you go from doctor's office to doctor's office, they're pretty much all going to tell you I'm 5'3", and that's probably right. Okay, so that may be very accurate. It can collect weight, but then if we turn that into body mass index, right, which is often used as a nutritional as an outcome of nutritional studies, well then it starts to be a little bit harder. That may be a very precise measure, but you could have a high BMI because you're overweight. You could have a high BMI because you're stunted, meaning you're very short. You could have a high BMI because you've been going to the gym every day, right? All of those things could give you a high BMI, but they represent something very, very different about your nutritional status. So that's a case where we have a very precise measurement, right? But if our goal is to understand something about nutritional status, we're nowhere near the bullseye, potentially. I mean, maybe we are, but we can't be confident that we're on the bullseye, right? Our underlying construct is something about are we healthy, okay? All right. So
就配合
to give you some slightly clearer definitions here, validity. In theory, we're going to be thinking about validity as how well the indicator maps on to the outcome. All right? Our example being, do IQ tests truly measure this underlying construct of intelligence? Then reliability, we're going to think about that coming in at 2 different points. Is this measure consistent and precise? Right? That's going to be both about the mapping of the indicator onto the construct. It's also going to be about the mapping of the responses that we get onto the indicator, which in turn is being mapped onto the construct. Okay? So this reliability point, we're going to break this down into response reliability and also reliability of the indicator. Okay? Okay? So this reliability point, we're going to break this down into response reliability and also reliability of the indicator. Okay?
等我上一下
这两栋房子有
Okay.
有
It
火，
onto the indicator, which in turn is being mapped onto the construct. Okay? So this reliability point, we're going to break this down into response reliability and also reliability of the indicator. Okay? It's also going to be about the mapping of the responses that we get onto the indicator, which in turn is being mapped onto the construct. Okay? So this reliability point, we're going to break this down to give you some slightly clearer definitions here. Validity. In theory, we're going to be thinking about validity as how well the indicator maps on to the outcome. All right? Our example being, do IQ tests truly measure this underlying construct of intelligence? Then reliability, we're going to think about that coming in at 2 different points. Is this measure consistent and precise? Right? That's going to be both about thinking about validity as how well the indicator maps on to the outcome. All right?
先换个
Our example being, do IQ tests truly measure this underlying construct of intelligence?
你
Then
让脚播了
reliability, we're going to think about that coming in at 2 different points. Is this measure consistent and precise? Right? That's going to be both about the mapping of the indicator onto the construct. It's also going to be about the mapping of the responses that we get
没了
onto the indicator, which in turn is being mapped onto the construct. Okay? So this reliability point, we're going to break consistent and precise.
哎不在
Right?
上面
That's going to be both about
上去
the mapping of the indicator onto the construct. It's also going to be about the mapping of the responses that we get
是真的
onto the indicator, which in turn is being mapped onto the construct. Okay? So this reliability point, we're going to break this down into response reliability and also reliability of the indicator. Okay? Okay. So what do you think? Which is worse? For validity, for reliability, they're both terrible, it
没
depends.
事没问题。
I have no idea.
有啊
没事没事没事举个杯吧
啊！哎，我出去了。
啊没事没事没事走吧带你们去跟那个妹妹玩
Nobody's worried about reliability. Huh, okay. I'll try to convince you that you should be worried about all of it. Right, there's no right answer here. they're all something to worry about. I'm not sure they're equally bad. I'm not sure it depends. I would say I don't know.
没有我的意思
But they're all something to worry about. And what I want to do with the time that we have remaining is try to think a little bit together about how to minimize the concerns, how to ensure that that your measures are going to be as
OK 我们先说好
valid and reliable
先
as
说
possible.
好就是你们
Okay, so let's do a few more little quizzes here. We're running a little bit behind, so give me your answers quickly, and then if you haven't weighed in, we'll just go with the numbers that we have. Okay, so the outcome that we want
两个人
to affect his annual consumption, the way we're going to measure it is with food expenditure in the last week. Do you think this is
打一把可以吗可奶声啊
Reliable, I guess it's very reliable because you can spend anything and you don't change your
就这样就好
food consumption or the
我来了，我来了。
But it's not that
你们不
下次
怎
不
么
一
样
样
没有没有随便的那我们
为了我的5块钱。
It's not your consumption. It's really just
你喜欢
a
打什
very
么
small portion of what people actually consume. You also consume other goods.
consumption? The way we're going to measure it is with food expenditure in the last week. Do you think this is a problem, or do you think we're going to run into more problems with this on validity, reliability, both or neither?
如果我打海岛135分钟，我可能要观战30分钟。但度假岛不一样，我顶多观战5分钟。
So there are going to be
但是
potentially some problems on both
你怎
dimensions.
么
All right.
当老板
The first on reliability. So the question is, are we actually measuring something that looks like annual consumption when we just asked about expenditures in the last week? So maybe not. Maybe last week was a
看看能不能
all-out
找
week and you spent all sorts of money and that actually has nothing to do with your typical consumption. Maybe last week you were at a JPAL training and so you didn't actually spend all that much because they kept you locked up in a classroom all the time, right? So again, that might not be very representative. So it may be that our indicator is not a great proxy for our underlying construct.
可以假装 然后我现在
On the
找
flip
我
side,
每
it's
天找一条
relatively easy to measure, to remember
通常
what
老
you spent
板
money
也
on
不
last
知
week.
道
What if instead we were to say we wanted to measure annual consumption with food expenditures in the last 3 months? You think then we'd run into more problems with
我们
validity,
到
reliability,
稍
both or neither?
微设低一点了吧？你说呢？
都行，都可以吧。
好嘞，然后设成雨宁。
Okay, good. So we've got some trade-offs here, right? We went from the last 1 week, which was pretty easy to remember, but on average is not going to be very close to the annual pattern,
那个
right?
话说你会吗？
Now we measure over 3 months. On the one hand, we're perhaps getting something that's a little bit more
不太会，
valid because it over 3 months that looks a little bit more like what you typically do in a year. On the other hand,
嗨，你好，Hello，
Hello，尊老板的，要打吗，小姐姐
多少钱一单？
？10块一单，
10块是几个人的？
一车10块一车。
这一看就是咱家的人。先问几块的这个？
几？这几个都是吗？
2个女孩，那2个名字特别可爱的女
买
孩
一送一，买
子和女生
一。送一，一个娱乐，一个解说，10块钱2个人。
这个看到女生会脸红是吗？
啊，是，她是技术。另外女孩子需要快的是娱乐点，就长了张嘴，啥也不会。谁在说话？
行，可以。
是谁在说话？
谁在说？我也不知道谁在说话。
我也不知道谁在说，
应
他俩在
该是草莓
想。
在说话。
没事，就是溜溜美啊。
就看他麦在动啊，应该是他吧？
可是我看出镜的也在闪。
是谁在说？
刚才是我在说，刚才是我在说。
真的
是初见对吗？
对。那咱们这个是先付钱还是后？打完再付啊？
妹妹，你说你想先付钱还是先打完？
没事，打完再付。
就是被骗过了，咱们还是说依然坚持是吗？还是对人性抱有一丝的信任，对吧？
对，我们要相信。
我非常的喜欢你这一点。那没事，没事有卖吗？
那行。Hello 有卖。
妹妹，你问他点不点你？
溜溜美要点吗？
你是娱乐赔吗？
对，然后脸会红是技术赔。
哦，好。
10块呀。
好。
你很开心哦，你非常开心呢。
可以。
OK， 那我们就看了。
Nobody's worried about reliability. And that we have remaining is little consumption. The way we're going to measure it is with food expenditure in the last week. Do you think this is a problem, or do you think we're going to run into more problems with this on validity, reliability, both or neither? What do you think?
你这话是跟谁都这么说，是吧？
你
这话说有点熟悉啊。
我跟你说的是去你我家，就是说是我没带他们回家呀，我带他们去扫地山。
哎，谁的麦有点长？
是我的吗？因为我没有听到。
So
我在充电。
有回音，刚刚。
there are going to be potentially some problems on both dimensions. All right. Expenditures in the last 3 months. You think there we'd run into more problems with validity, reliability, both or neither?
跟老伴跳伞的。
不要跟我跳。
妹妹，你不怪他，给你跑单了，真的。
Okay, good. So we've got some trade-offs here, right? We went from the last 1 week, which was pretty easy to remember, but on average is not going to be very close to the annual pattern, right? Now we measure over 3 months. On the one hand, we're perhaps getting something that's a little bit more valid because over 3 months, that looks a little bit more like what you typically do in a year. On the other hand, it's going to be really hard to remember what you did over the last 3 months, right? So you might forget a bunch of things, right? So we might be getting something that's a little bit biased in some way or potentially less reliable, but that's because of the response, right? So that's a response reliability problem.
2号最近咳嗽吗？
最近有点。
哦，怎么回事？为什么是跟着我呀？出事了！
不是，
你们这个
刚刚不
可以相信吗？这是怎么回事？
没人跟我飞是吧？
刚刚不是跟随你了吗？
啊，对呀，
跟着我们。哎呦， 哎呀，出事了，要出事了！
完了，你这是出大事了呀！嘿，
啊，
这
完了，我们还下不来。
Hello， 你好。Hello，
还跟他交流一下。
Hello，
你好，可以不打吗？我这边3个女生，她们都没过来。
4个，你说还在天上呢。
嗨，你好，把门打开就可以看到我了。我队友不在这边，我在这边。
我们来了。
来，
那你怎么办？
我可能得让队友过来，他们忘记跟随我跳伞了。
刚刚说我们来了。
对，我的队友他们来了，他们来了。
那我们不打好吧？不打，那你的队友也不要打我。
你们过来，不要？你们过来，他们刚刚。
Let's think a little bit about the response process and where challenges can come up when we're thinking about responses. This is going to be measurement error. We're going to talk a little bit about. Let's think a little bit about the response process and where challenges can come up when we're thinking about responses. This is going to be measurement error. We're going to talk a little bit about measurement error for a while. Okay. Let's think about this response process. First, you ask a question, the respondent has to understand the question. That may seem like a trivial part of this problem. It's actually very, very difficult. You'll see that. You ask a question, they understand it, and then they have to go search in their brain a little bit, try to retrieve the information that you're after. And then they have to do some processing. Okay, so I've retrieved the information, now I have to think about how to categorize it, how to shape it into the response that you're after. And then finally, I have to tell you. And it may be that there are other reasons that I just don't want to give you the answer that I've come up with, and so I'll give you something that might be a little bit more socially acceptable. All right, let's think about each of these. An example. This nice enumerator here is asking this nice respondent here, how many times did you consume rice this month? Now, the respondent has to understand this question. This could turn out to be a little harder than it seems, right? So the respondent may be thinking, okay, how many times did I consume rice this month? Does this guy mean rice just in a bowl that I ate just straight up? Does this mean any product that contained rice? Does this mean what does this mean exactly? Are they asking about rice as an ingredient? Are they asking about rice being directly consumed? Rice flour? Rice crackers? Rice noodles? Right. So there might be a comprehension.
好，拜拜，拜拜，走了，拜拜。
Your turn to be a respondent. Tell me, do you prefer sitting or not?
拜，先走了，拜拜。好嘞，我们走吧。快走，待会犯规了。
去那边，我们去右边吧。
快走吧，待会他们犯规了。
Okay, excellent. You may have all understood that question a little bit differently, right? So, what's the alternative? What alternative did you think? What were you comparing sitting to? Lying down, doing jumping jacks, standing on your head, right? Sitting to what? Okay, so sitting to every other possible thing. If that's the question, then probably not, right? But so, in some ways, that was a very simple question. In other ways, your comprehension of that question may have varied widely within the room. The circumstances, right? Sitting in this classroom, sitting on an airplane, sitting in the mosh pit at a rock concert. I don't know. So depending on where you are, depending on what the alternatives are, not a particularly well-worded question. Think about the next stage here. Retrieval of information. Okay, how many times did I consume rice this month? So this individual is going to start thinking about, okay, how many times processing, trying to retrieve this information. Going to think about last week. Well, last week I ate rice twice. And I think that that was a pretty representative week, about 4 weeks in a month. So we're going to say I ate rice about 8 times.
Yeah.
那个螳螂在那咆哮。
螳螂的腰好细呀，命弯刀。
妹妹，其实曾经啊，我也是做陪陪的，要不要我传授一些经验给你啊
？OK， 虚心接受，姐姐说。那我先问一下，你被考过单吗？
不是我想问一下，你这有什么项目啊？
什么按脚来了？还有项目吗？想问什么项目啊？
你娱乐陪陪的有点才艺啥的吗？
妹妹教你的。
第一天单还没想好，怎么夸自己？我有个特长，就是我讲话特快，你发现没？就小时候念课文，别人还在念一半，我就已经念完了。
耳朵可能不太好。
耳朵？
但是他耳朵可能不太好。
你说快了，我听不懂。
那我说慢点。
他就这么一个特长，你还让他说慢点，你这多少有点过分了。
是我可以把自己的特长录掉，
就把它光折一折是吧？一共就这么点特长，他就你说话慢。哦，他是老板，没有陈述一点经验哈。
你说，
就是咱们要
你
主打一
不也是陪
个
玩吗？
服务至上。
你这个
知道什么叫服务至上吗？
你说，
服务至上就是坚决拥护老板，把老板放在第一位，人机让给老板，时时刻刻保护老板，不能让老板空着闲着。
对，我去找1号了。
哦，所以你就自动把2号划分给我啊、OK， 好，给你展示一波。
因为你在他旁边，1号在后面。
那你这雨露均沾的话，你怎么做呢？他们都点你，你不得？
我不得。
把这衣服给我穿呗。
给我整不会了。
初见，把那衣服给我穿。初见。初见。
你们是？
把那衣服给我穿。扣子。
没有听清。
我说你们是刚做这个陪玩没多久吗？
扣子。
好像业务不太熟练。
第1天。我是第1天。
初见是真认真的。
对呀。
哦，那我俩还挺幸运。
那1号有点冷吧？
你俩第2天。
1号老板要不要换件衣服穿呢？我感觉你有点冷嘞，我们换件衣服穿，把这件衣服给你穿，有点新鲜感。
哦，2号老板要换衣服吗？2号老板，给你换件衣服穿。
你穿
快换，
不好看。
我感觉你的衣服不好看。
啊，不好看，那没办法了。
我的好看。
我就带了2套衣服，还有1套。
走。
还有1套，那套不行，那套趴地上太明显了。
你穿什么衣服啊？你要给他？
一套粉的。
来，我看看。
妈，这个吗？他嫌弃，老板又嫌弃我。老板穿一下吧，老板，给面子。
你有没有哭过这个呢？这还有一个呢。
你都给他小白龙，为什么你们有2套小白龙啊？
我没给他，他没要啊。
啊？
我不能有是吗？
妹妹，你这个业务不熟悉。
我以为他刚刚给你了，然后又变出来1套。
给你展示一下真正的专业技术配备。来，老板，你往前走，我跟着你后面，时刻保护你的安全。学。
老板不应该走后面。对呀。
你学呀。
死得更快呢。
你不跟着他后面。你学呀。
我都搞不清楚是哪个老板在讲话。
没有，我说你跑单真是有原因的。
太难了。行，让我先走。
Week, about 4 weeks in a month, so we're gonna say I ate rice about 8 times.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
好。
I guess we skipped a little bit to judgment estimation, so
我教你
stop at 2 times. The next step is gonna be getting to 8. Okay.
你过来。
Fine.
来。
2 rices. Monday,
好
Thursday.
1号你别动。
All right. Now.
来，妹妹你给我背贴。
Your turn to review the respondent. When you received your first measles vaccine, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being painless, 5 being unbearably painful, what was your level of pain?
OK， 好，枪拿上，往左走。
左哪边是左啊？哪边是左啊？
对，往你的右边走。好，1号跟着走，1号跟着走。咱们是个保镖题目，咱们就是一个保镖题目。
So. Roughly what I would expect, somewhere in the middle, right? You don't remember probably the last time you received, the first time you received a measles vaccination. For many of us, this was quite a while ago, right? So you're probably doing all sorts of weird approximations. All right, it was probably a typical shot. I don't know, right? I don't think it was much worse or much better, but who knows? I was really small. Maybe it was terrible. So somewhere in the middle, kind of safe answer. Terrible question, right? None of you can probably remember that, all right? So the idea that maybe you comprehended this question perfectly well, but you couldn't retrieve the information. That information is too distant memory. You can't actually retrieve that information. So 18 of you answered the question, right? I got some data out of it, but that data does not map on to what I actually care about measuring at all. Okay? All right. Now,
你要像
our respondent has to do a little math, right? I already did it, but we're now, I combined steps 2 and 3. Step 3 is going to be, all right, last week was one full week, I had rice twice. Now, this person's asking me how many times do I typically eat rice, or how many times did I eat rice in the last month? I think last week looked about like the other weeks in the month. I think there are about 4 weeks in a month. So I'm going to give 8 as my answer. Okay? So that's a little bit of judgment and estimation that has to happen even on a very, very simple question. Like, how many times did you eat rice in the last month, right? Now, what about you? How many calories do you think you consumed in your last large meal yesterday?
毕竟这个价钱摆在这边了。
所以我们也没有太高的要求。
其实可以要求可以往上拔吧。我3号可以做到的
咱能
话。
咱能定下5呗。
Now, you probably had to do some judgment and estimation to get to these responses, right? So anybody want to volunteer the thought process briefly?
刚是谁要5、6来着？哪个老板来着？
Okay, no, tell us.
No, I would say, I mean, like in the larger scheme, this actually lost a lot of weight many years ago, so I can pull the problem. And so over time, it's become an automatic process. You can estimate based on a lot of individual experience.
Good, but then you also probably had to you had to think about what exactly did I eat during that meal, you had to think about portion sizes, you had to think about what you know about caloric content of each of these different foods, right? And you're coming at this from a very informed standpoint, and it still required probably a fair amount of estimation, right? So exactly, I mean, this again is not a very straightforward question. I could have perhaps done better by breaking this question down for you and asking about individual foods, about portion sizes, about different things like that, that would have made your answers a little bit more accurate. Okay, fine. Then the last step is going to be turning this calculation that you've just done into a response. So again, our trusted respondent needs to now tell the enumerator how many times did you eat rice, buy rice, eat rice this month? 8, right? So that's going to fall into this category. Good. What about you?
这个
等我看能不能中。
Okay, no, this is not chosen to be funny. This is chosen to illustrate the fact that even after you. Okay, no, this is not chosen to be funny. This is chosen to illustrate the fact that even after you go through the process, understanding the question, figuring out what your answer actually is, there may be things that then in the process of communicating that to the enumerator, information breaks down, right? So in this case. We see what your answers are, okay? This is anonymous. Imagine I had gone up to each of you and asked you to your face. Your answers actually might have been slightly different. Now, I could reword this question just a little bit. And these response categories in some ways are giving you permission to use a lot of drugs, all right? So if I really want an accurate measure, I might want to change mission to use a lot of, and these response categories in some ways are giving you permission to use a lot of drugs, right? So if I really want an accurate measure, I might want to change these response categories a little bit. But even something like this can be a signal to the respondent of what's socially acceptable behavior here, right? So notice before, there were some pretty loaded terms up here, right? I said, here, right? So notice before, there were some pretty loaded terms up here, right? I said, if you, in the past 12 months, used drugs 4 times, you're a user. If you used it more than 4 times, you're an addict, right? That's pretty loaded. Turning it into something like this, while these again may not be the exact right categories to use, reframes the question in pretty dramatic ways, okay?
快把多狼护好，我往前走，咱们就这么个多狼了，咱把架好。先进圈嘛。哇，我跟你说，他这个让我能想起我之前做培培的时候，就是跟手机的老板打着打着，然后他就问你说你打吗？然后我们就以为他要点了，
没事。
然后后来
吃个死鸡也是可以。
后来结果你以为他在给你点单，结果他只是下来玩，然后陪了3、4个小时，1分钱不赚。所以我觉得培培其实也挺累的。但有时候变熟悉之后就会不好意思问，所以我每次碰到培培，我基本上都会付一点。然后那时候我在家可便宜了， 而且有时候面子脸皮
大
薄薄，
老板你没要了吗？
不好意思问他要，比如说他点你2个小时，但其实玩4个小时，
有没有
但是会不好意思跟他说让他补那2个小时，那就相当于那2个小时是给他的，完了你还就是拒绝了别人的单子，相当于你还倒亏了。
那个老板都死了，你们能不能安慰一下我呀？唱个歌什么的。
唱歌有点要命，想听啥？老板喜欢什么？平时喜欢听谁的歌？
乌梅子酱。
啊？
啊？怎么了？
这最近太火了吧
4号会唱是吗？4号唱一个乌梅子酱也行。
行，让我们来4号唱乌梅子酱，鼓掌。
初见想上黑名单吗？初见，是不是想上黑名单？
让我们静静的聆听。
我相信他不会这样子的，是吧？
乌梅子酱多好听啊！
因为我觉得你应该不是这样的人。
老板想听你唱。
我觉得他应该是想听你唱。
不，老板说了。
不，那你刚刚可能听错了。1号你说说看，你到底想听谁唱？你得好好说，跟着心走。好好说，想听谁唱？
那心跟着你走吧。
你的声音好听，我想听你唱。
别回家，把门锁上，
不要违背老板的意愿。
我是技术派，妹妹你忘记了。
2号老板也想听，
这是你以后可以干的事情。你们业务要扩展的。哎，1号，我平常回家有没有人给你留门呢？今天回家会不会门锁了？会不会给你关门外呀？有没有过？
好像。
那对面这啥呀？车
哪里？
那里。
是咱别转移话题呀。人家俩谁唱完了，也有人唱，那就娱乐陪唱呗。
唱歌真的有点随意。你要听吗？可以唱，我可以唱，没事儿。
我都会听到，
就是不是
形容自己唱歌随意的。
就是真不怎么样，有时候好，有时候还行，有时候就不能听。
看远了。
你这个评价挺诚恳的，就什么时候唱歌是好的，我在好的时候来。
哦，哎呀，现在肯定不行。
这是什么声音？
哇，天哪，哇，老板多好，老板多好，老板多好，来这边救我，老板。
哎，你们在哪个打的？
不知道，好像是。
行了，不用唱了，不用唱了。
175，175，175。
175是哪个方向
？175，它就是这儿嘛。
需要朝这个方向，
需要朝这个方向。
他凭什么那么远打着你吗？
对啊。他可能有背景。老板，快进圈，堵死了。
Kelsey just went through an example of rice consumption. After asking the number of times the respondent purchased or consumed rice, we may ask about the average amount purchased or consumed each time. It's likely this is part of a larger group of questions that will eventually give us an aggregate measure of total food expenditure, in which case poverty might be the construct we care about. Or it could aggregate to total calories consumed, if it's nutrition that we care about. So assuming we've zeroed in on a precise definition of rice, meaning what should be included in the retrieval process and what should be excluded, and assuming we've made it clear what we mean by times consumed, a spoonful, a serving, a meal, then in theory there should be a correct answer. What we're asking for is a fact. Facts are behaviors, actions, or states of the world. If we had the ability to independently monitor respondents' actions continuously during the reference period, we could verify whether or not their response were true. What if we then asked how much the respondent enjoyed rice in general, or each time it was consumed? Then we are asking about an opinion or an attitude. What if we asked them?
哇，妹妹，你这个牛了！我倒是有烟。
不是，不进去。进去我床底。
What if we then asked how much the respondent enjoyed rice in general, or each time it was consumed? Then we are asking about an opinion or an attitude. What if we ask them how much they think their neighbors eat? That would be a perception. Quick note. What if we ask them how much they think their neighbors eat? What if we then ask how much the respondent enjoyed rice in general, or each time it was consumed? Then we are asking about an opinion or an attitude. What if we ask them how much they think their neighbors eat? That would be a perception. Quick note, this is slightly different from asking them directly how much their neighbors eat, which would be a fact. We're asking them explicitly how much they think their neighbors eat. They may get the amount wrong, but if they're being truthful, it's an accurate reflection of what they think. What if we ask about how much they think their neighbors eat? They may get the amount wrong, but if they're being truthful, it's an accurate reflection of what they think. What if we ask about how much rice they hope or expect to consume in the next month? That would be an aspiration or expectation question. This latter group is made up of subjective measures. There is no way to verify their truth. And there may not even be constant truth. Someone's opinion could be one thing when they respond, but it could change after a few seconds of reflection. It could depend on their mood, their energy levels, or even how we word the question, or other questions we've asked earlier on in the survey. And in the middle, there are quasi-facts. For example, someone's race, religion, ethnicity, or gender. Quasi-facts are indicators where the response could be motivated by objective factors like one's biology or family background, but there could also be subjective elements to the response based on one's own personal identity. Some subjective perception measures could be considered quasi-facts depending on how the question is worded, and by the same token, some objective measures could be considered quasi-facts if not worded precisely enough, if there's room for interpretation. For example, if we were considered quasi-facts if not worded precisely enough, if there's room for interpretation. Some subjective perception measures could be considered quasi-facts depending on how the question is worded, and by the same token, some objective measures could be considered quasi-facts if not worded precisely enough, if there's room for interpretation. For example, if we were imprecise about our definition of rice, deliberately allowing respondents to interpret the question as they please, allowing them to include rice noodles if they wanted or not, then our factual measure would become a quasi-fact. Similarly, the extent to which gender or race is a factual question depends on the precision of our question and how exhaustive the response options are. For example, we could ask about gender at birth, and then give a more comprehensive list of response options than just male and female. We could also ask about the race of respondents' biological parents and give them an exhaustive list of possible identities and allow multiple options to be checked. We may find it in our best interest to be deliberate about whether our measure is supposed to be objective or subjective and minimize the potential for unintended overlap.
咱们第二吗？
对，
可是这样也算
这怎么不算？
加分就可以了。第二
这算不算？
可以。我的目标是前5。
要睡觉了？
行。
老板，你是不是该结账了？
对。
妹给他个信息。
微信。
等会儿，妹妹，你等会儿。
等会儿。
Facts can fall into 2 high-level categories, states of being and actions and behaviors. And within those categories, a state of being can be permanent or fluctuating. Meanwhile, actions and behaviors could be habitual or episodic. Permanent facts includes date or district of birth, for example. Fluctuating facts may include current age or district of residence. Habitual behaviors may include regularly attending school. One-time or infrequent actions may include the purchase of a television. With permanent facts, no matter how much time passes, the answers to these questions should not change. As such, these indicators would never be outcomes or outputs we would expect to change as part of our theory of change or impact evaluation. Rather, they may be used as covariates or for subgroup analysis, or the answers to these questions should not change. As such, these indicators would never be outcomes or outputs we would expect to change as part of our one-time or infrequent actions may include the purchase of a television. With permanent facts, no matter how much time passes, the answers to these questions should not change. As such, these indicators would never be outcomes or outputs we would expect to change as part of our theory of change or impact evaluation. Rather, they may be used as covariates or for subgroup analysis, or to describe our sample to better understand the environment and context. With fluctuating facts, these may change at any time, sometimes in a predictable way, like through the passage of time, as is the case with age, years of education, or years of experience. Other times, these facts may change due to outside circumstances. Many of the demographic information we get, such as marital status, number of children, household size, variables about socioeconomic status, are all potentially subject to change. Others can be fluctuating, but ultimately become static. For example, the number of times a woman has given childbirth could change during her reproductive years, but at some point that number will no longer change. Highest educational level attained is also less likely to change as an adult gets older. Last, whether a fact is permanent or fluctuating may depend on the wording of our question. If we ask country of residence as of a certain date, then our fluctuating fact becomes a permanent fact. Many fluctuating facts are determined by past behaviors, actions, and decisions. For example, school attendance determines ultimate level of education attained. Our fluctuating fact becomes a permanent fact. Many fluctuating facts are determined by past behaviors, actions, and decisions. For example, school attendance determines ultimate level of education attained. A one-time migration may determine current. Our fluctuating fact becomes a permanent fact. Many fluctuating facts are determined by past behaviors, actions, and decisions. For example, school attendance determines ultimate level of education attained. A one-time migration may determine current district of residence. These distinctions are important because they dictate when in the study we may want to ask the question. In theory, permanent facts can be asked at any point in time. However, if the answer to fluctuating facts changes, and say it changes in our treatment and control groups at different rates due to the intervention, then we may not want to use them as control variables or to check the balance between our two groups at the beginning. And whether an action is habitual or episodic changes how we phrase the question. Perhaps in the former, we want to ask about frequency, in which case our reference period, whether it is the past 1 week, 1 month, or past 6 months, may not matter quite as much. Whereas in the latter, our reference period may influence the response significantly. When we measure facts, we want to leave as little room for interpretation as possible, lest they become quasi-facts. As we saw in the rice example, we need to clearly define concepts. Let's use a different example of perhaps a fluctuating fact we might see in a demographic module of a questionnaire. How many members are there in your household? What is a household? Many families live in joint members are there in your household. What is a household? Many families live in joint households with, for example, 2 sets of cousins.
怎么了，小姐姐？
你在干嘛呀？
你发太多了，你发太多了。
你在干嘛呀？
我朋友拉我打字牌呀。
哦，这你朋友，没事，我撤了，不要转中文，不要再转回国，你应该的。那我走了，我以为你在当老板。
太多了，你还多给了？
没事，拜拜，我走了。
不行。
小玉，快，别说他的。等我们的牌搭子。把搭子让我等他一会儿，有本观战。
Many families live in joint households with, for example, 2 sets of cousins all living under the same roof. Members are there in your household. What is a household? Many families live in joint households with, for example, 2 sets of cousins all living under the same roof. Is that 1 or 2 households? Some residences are complexes with several families and shared facilities such as latrines or water sources. Often, a household is defined as those who share a single kitchen, but there are other definitions as well. Who can be considered a household member? Adolescents who are at boarding school for 9 months of the year? Or fathers who are migrant laborers for 6 months of the year? And what is a room in a household? Is it a bathroom, a closet, a vestibule? In general, being more precise about each question makes it easier for the respondent to answer. However, if explaining the details of what to include and what to exclude, it could make the question unwieldy and even harder to comprehend, and therefore take longer to administer. We need to decide how much imprecision we're willing to live with. And as always, it's useful to look at the way questions are worded in standard questionnaires. This also ensures consistency if we were to aggregate data from different datasets. Whether we're asking about household size or rice consumption, it's critical to understand local context and culture. We need to know what households look like and in what form people eat rice. What are typical quantities or measurements used to purchase or consume rice? Also, we need to keep in mind that some facts, specifically certain past behaviors, actions, or decisions, may be considered sensitive topics, for example, sexual activity. Often, too much precision makes it more uncomfortable for a respondent to answer. Even permanent facts like ethnicity can be sensitive in some settings. So asking sensitive questions may require a different approach. We'll discuss how to measure sensitive questions later on in this section.
谢谢舒赖的比清图图，谢谢舒赖。谢谢加尔的漏灯牌，谢谢加尔，谢谢海绵宝宝带的祝贺，谢谢13的花开烂漫，谢谢13，谢谢初见带的祝贺，谢谢这英语怎么读来的 ？Jasper， 哎呀你，谢谢 JP 的神枪手，谢谢雅剧的真爱你，谢谢雅剧，谢谢雅剧，谢谢高冷肖的真爱你，谢谢高冷肖。
Subjective phenomena such as opinions, beliefs, attitudes are specific and unique to each person. Granted, they may be similar amongst people within a group or amongst those who share common characteristics or experiences. They can be influenced by others or the environment. They can change, and they can be shared with others. But according to Duncan, Bischoff, and Turner, subjective phenomena are known for certain only by the individual him or herself. They are psychological states. They are not verifiable by external observations or records. They are what we've called unobservable. One construct we've been discussing is motivation. We often use motivation as an unobserved characteristic that can help predict whether or not someone takes up a program, and also as a determinant of our impact measure. Because we cannot measure motivation, we cannot control for it in an observational study. And therefore, leaving it out of the regression could lead to omitted variable bias. In theory, we can try to measure motivation using a subjective question. For example, how motivated do you consider yourself? However, this is a construct our respondent may not understand, or it may largely be hidden in one's subconscious and therefore cannot be measured with any accuracy. Subjectivity has three broad components: beliefs, expectations, and attitudes. Of subjective measures, beliefs are closely linked to facts. They are a person's perception of facts. For a few constructs, such as sensitive topics, subjective questions are used to measure facts because a person's perception is perhaps the closest we can get to the truth. Other times, they are used to measure unobservable phenomena. Like as sensitive topics, subjective questions are used in attitudes. Of subjective measures, beliefs are closely linked to facts. They are a person's perception of facts. For a few constructs, such as sensitive topics, subjective questions are used to measure facts because a person's perception is perhaps the closest we can get to the truth. Other times, they are used to measure unobservable phenomena, like one's intrinsic motivation. Many times, however, they are used to assess a respondent's knowledge, and when analyzed, will be explicitly compared to the fact which we've measured objectively. For example, we as researchers may know that cigarettes are unhealthy, but we want to know whether a respondent is aware of this. Many of our interventions take the form of information campaigns or have heavy information sharing components. Perhaps improving knowledge is a key intermediate outcome in our theory of change. Subjective questions can be about predicting facts in the future. Improving knowledge is a key intermediate outcome in information campaigns or have heavy information sharing components. Perhaps improving knowledge is a key intermediate outcome in our theory of change. Subjective questions can be about predicting facts in the future. They can reflect expectations of the way things will be, or perhaps improving knowledge is information campaigns or have heavy information sharing components. Perhaps improving knowledge is a key intermediate outcome in our theory of change. Subjective questions can be about predicting facts in the future. They can reflect expectations of the way things will be or how individuals are expected to behave or act in the future. Expectations could be optimistic. Subjective questions can be about predicting facts in the future. They can reflect expectations of the way things will be or how individuals are expected to behave or act in the future. Expectations could be optimistic or pessimistic or neither. However, when incorporating both an expectation and desire, it could be called an aspiration. For example, someone may aspire to quit smoking. Alternatively, they may expect their daughter to drop out of school after 5th grade, even though they wish she went to college. Last, attitudes are similar to beliefs and intentions, but rather than being perceptions of facts, they're perceptions of the way things should be or could be. They apply a normative judgment or personal value to an action, a person, or state of being. When judging the way things are or should be, they could be considered opinions. For example, associating cigarettes with being cool is an attitude. Being cool and how one becomes cool is a personal value. Subjective questions are usually never the ultimate impact outcome we intend to measure. However, they are very useful as an intermediate outcome. If individuals are unaware of the dangers of cigarette smoke, we probably need to change their beliefs before expecting them to stop smoking. Or subjective measures can help us understand the context and possibly assumptions under which our theory of change will work. An information campaign on the dangers of smoking may not be as effective if people are already aware, but rather think it's worth the cost to look cool. Rachel Lannister described this in her generalizability lecture. An information campaign to inform young women that older men are more likely to have HIV than younger men will likely only be effective if, at the very least, young women are unaware of this fact to begin with. With facts, we often have a very precise understanding of what the indicator is meant to measure, and therefore the question can be phrased equally precisely. And with subjective questions about beliefs or expectations, the topic may also be specific. We may know exactly what is meant by educational attainment, and therefore, asking a mother what grade level she hopes or expects her daughter to achieve is a fairly clear question. All questions about beliefs or expectations, the topic may also be specific. We may know exactly what is meant by educational attainment, and therefore, asking a mother what grade level she hopes or expects her daughter will achieve is a fairly clear question. Although, there may be some uncertainty around the mother's prediction or aspiration, and therefore her response. But the question itself should be unambiguous. However, attitudes may be closer to a feeling. If we ask the question too precisely, we may end up getting a belief, expectation, or even a fact in response, rather than something closer to a sentiment. And of course, as with sensitive facts, there are sensitive, subjective questions as well. A father may believe that a girl should not be educated and may hope to have his daughter married by the age of 12. But if he knows that's an unpopular position or possibly illegal, he may not respond with an answer that reflects his true opinion. We will discuss how to deal with sensitive topics more in detail later using direct and indirect techniques.
那你还跟我玩吗？
Attitude as an aspiration.
Subjective phenomena such as opinions believe that a girl should not be educated and may hope to have his daughter married to a sentiment, or to a feeling, prediction, or aspect. Question can be phrased then. An information campaign on the dangers of smoking may not be as effective if people are already aware, but rather think it's worth the cost to look cool. Rachel Lannister can help us understand the context and possibly assumptions under which our theory of change will work. An information campaign on the dangers of smoking may not be when judged.
我刚刚听到什么？
没有啊。
啊，我妹妹，挺好的。我们，哎，你没有戴耳机吗？我听到一点回音啊。
等会儿，
好嘞。
那应该是。
今天又是美好的一
现在
天。
呢？
现在感觉好很多。
飞机很快就要。
出事了。
their beliefs before expecting them to stop smoking. Or subjective measures can help us understand the context. Last, attitudes are similar to
今天又是
subjective.
太客气了，太客气了。
要什么自己接，别客气。
Layer one on top of the other.
飞机很快
我跟
就要起飞
你说的是新的是我家，
这准备
就是说我没带他们回家呀，我带他们去扫地伞。
Let's get this. Showing off, are we? Rather.
There they are, up ahead.
I'll let you lead.
No one in.
Biscuit is fine, as am I.
Someone's so ignorant.
You don't know what you're saying. Take a breath for a moment.
Oh, I know precisely what I'm saying. Croft's become. Should we head there now?
We should wait.
Why?
All this time, we've been a step behind Runrock. I may know someone who could help us get ahead.
Who is that?
Is it the same?
这个里面的话，你找不到这个东西，然后我们的这个怎么去水墨画的风格？哇，你看这广泛一点，甚至连一些粉红色，一些比较淡红。Which makes it really hard for people who do not really know the art to, simply find things that they are interested to look at. And of course, it's a challenge for art historians as well, because often the times, if you are trying to study how a certain thing is depicted over time, you probably have to literally do that manually, maybe even walk the galleries or something. But of course, the whole idea is that AI should be able to help us do this a lot more efficiently and effectively. And at the end of the day, we do not want to do this tagging manually, because that could involve lots and lots of effort, right? And I think the kind of like the overarching problem behind all this is really what people call the cross depiction problem in literature. That is, how do you tell that a banana is a banana no matter how it varies in style and visual depiction, whether it's in a cartoon or in an artwork or in a photograph. This is something that's super easy for humans to do, right? But super tough for machines to crack at the moment. So what we're trying to do here in terms of object detection is actually sort of pointing somewhat towards that direction as well. So that's the problem that we are, so those are some of the problems that we're trying to deal with effectively. An approach that we are taking is really, again, it's a bit of a double whammy and a vicious cycle in which, because there's no data available, the AI cannot be trained. And because the AI will be trained, this will never get done by humans alone. So what we're really doing here is actually to automate the British verifying how Hello world. Have you ever wanted to find 50 shades of grey in art? Now you can. I am happy to share with you about our API, a tool to automatically annotate attributes in artworks, color and objects in particular, so that art can be made more accessible. Let's start with the problem. The problem is that unless you already know what you want to find, chances are you won't be able to find your desired artwork on the current collections portal of National Gallery Singapore. Take for example boats. If you do a search for boats, only 66 results are returned from this collection of close to 10,000. If your search keyword is not in the title, or any of this can be invited to correct or suggest new data as an API for the. Thank you for listening to Ernie's generated voice speaking, because the human Ernie is